dokie.
Alrighty, sound good. Let's do it.
All righty. Well, willkommen. It's 13th of June, 5 p.m. Eastern, a little bit after. Welcome to This and That Information, part of the Autonomous Collective.net activity. Today, we're going to finish up Simon Clarke's summary of Capital Volume 1. We haven't even gotten to Volume 2 yet, but considering it's about 900 some odd pages, we've covered a lot of distance in a couple of days. But, it's a summary, it's clip notes, however you want to view it. But I did want to introduce some ideas for this closing portion, mainly because at around wherever this we've decided to start again, chapter 24, whatever, Simon Clarke decides to give a brief summary, which of what has been covered so far, so that the last 200 or 300 some odd pages doesn't seem so awful. So that's what it is. Note that there will be a couple of chapters skipped, and note, of course, that other people like Andy Higginbottom introduce their own lectures on Volume 1 with some visitation of some of the later chapters, 26, 31, etc. And so it all is of a piece, and you don't need to just necessarily start at page 1 and go to page 900, whatever. Rather, it's, you need to be sort of relax, just relax. It'll be fine. So the point, of course, is that labor becomes, at the end, incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. Now, integument sort of refers to kind of the biggest organ in your body, and that is, yes, it's your skin, not any other feature. Rather, the integument is the network of features that forms the covering of an organism, separating it from the environment and protecting it from foreign matter. So Marx at the end is talking, well, I don't know if he's talking about his carbuncles. That would be sort of a part of the joke, I suppose. But he is talking about the idea of appearance being sort of a surface sort of thing. And so that brought to mind Star Wars and the Tauntaun episode in whatever the hell it is, episode 5, I guess, on Hoth, the ice planet, and where they cut open the Tauntaun to stay alive during a frigid night. And so there's, numerous jokes about cutting open animals and sort of living inside them and killing animals, which is awful as well. The question, of course, not unlike Mythbusters, is to ask, well, whether you could stay alive doing that. And it's sort of revisited in the DiCaprio Revenant movie. So you sort of want to, think about that. What are all these things about survivalism and all that stuff? And I always think at the end of this, relative to technology, it is as Bob Greene used to refer to it, there are survivalists and then there are looters, and that's pretty much what you got. It's sort of sad that it would come that way, but sort of that's what happens. So Tauntaun, once the wave of nausea passes and an obvious question remains, would that really work? How long could you survive frigid temperatures inside an animal carcass? So I included actually an article that discusses this kind of question, noting, of course, that's the integument, because it cuts down, sort of the windshield factor. That perhaps what it's more about. And then I, of course, included the, just because it's amusing to me, the alien chest burster scene. So all of this is about, this kind of question of consumption. The idea of in the alien case, you've awakened from a long sleep that comes from space travel. And so, consumption is sort of important, when you wake up. And it is about accumulation of capital. That's kind of what Marx is hinting at. He tries to sort of say, well, if you're going to use only volume one, you need to get through the entire circulation, the entire cycle of these kinds of matters. We now begin to move out from the immediate process of production. It is perhaps a good idea at this point to look back over the readings so far. This is Simon Clarke talking, and he's going to get us to the end of volume one. Marx started off by examining the commodity and the commodity relation. It's the social relation between commodity owners. Remember, it's still about property. It's always going to be about property. He examined money as a developed form of value that emerged out of exchange, and then introduced the concept of capital's self-expanding value. This is that valorization deal. The concept of capital then took Marx beyond the commodity relation and relations of exchange, starting from the relation between capitalist and laborer as an exchange relation between commodity owners, still about property. Marx moved behind this relation to the sphere of production. Now remember, there's a sphere of production, and there are other spheres that are at work. We haven't gotten to them yet. The sphere of production in which the capitalist set the laborer to work. He then analyzed in detail the production of surplus value in the immediate process of production, where the relation between laborer and capitalist is no longer a relation of equality between commodity owners, but an exploitative relation in which capital seeks to maximize the surplus value it appropriates. That is, make the day longer, get you to work harder, whatever. Marx distinguished the labor process from the valorization process. And that's important. How is it that capital builds on top of labor or whatever? And argued that the capitalist production is a combination of the two, in which it is valorization that is in command. In other words, you could self-valorize. Are you doing it for yourself, thinking that, this is going to help my subsistence? And you could do that, but largely it's a command question. Capitalists organizes, it's the social relations of production. In other words, how many hours you're going to work, how long you're going to be at that one machine, et cetera, et cetera. Whether you're going to be replaced by a kid, whatever. He then went on to examine absolute surplus value and the means of producing absolute surplus value by lengthening the working day. So remember, there's absolute and relative surplus value. He then turned to relative surplus value and the means of producing this by revolutionizing the means of production. Now, this revolutionizing is really more about innovation, right? You can get a better machine, or you can make the machines move faster because you got to hook to a belt, to a water wheel, or to a steam engine. And you can sort of speed shit up, but there's a kind of limit to that. At some moment the belts break and blah, 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 or there's not enough water running or blah, blah, blah. This led him to examine in great detail the way in which capitalist control of the process of production transforms production as both a social and a technical process in the search for relative surplus value. People like Smith and Ricardo don't get that far, and that's kind of the difference. That's why it's a critique of political economy, ultimately. Finally, Marx had a digression on wages, arguing that wages are the form of appearance of the price of labor power in which it appears that all labor is paid for. You work for X dollars per hour, and, that's kind of it. You don't need to worry about it, But on the other hand, and if you look in the fine print, it is thus a form of fetishism, just like the value form, in which reality is concealed. Now, that reality, those of us who work, that when you look at your pay stub, other stuff is being taken out, and these are important. You get to save some of it, or the company saves it for you, or they saves it in your name, and therefore when the tax man comes around, blah, 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 blah. So other things are happening. The pay stub seems important. It certainly is. And for some people, it's made important. You've got to come in with a pay stub, et cetera. But it isn't quite as real as you might want to think. So far, the analysis of the production of surplus values looks simply at one production period. In other words, there are many production periods. However, once surplus value has been produced and incorporated into the original capital, the new enlarged capital is laid out again. This is reproduction, production in multiple periods. Thus, capitalist production has a fundamental dynamic, the dynamic of accumulation, in which the scale of capitalist production constantly expands. It is the dynamic of accumulation that governs the development of capitalist society, for it is not simply a quantitative expansion. The increasing scale of accumulation also produces qualitative changes. So quantitative, qualitative, that's always important. Those of you social scientists know that you can't have one without the other, even though you might try to overdetermine one. The concept of capital accumulation is therefore central to Marx's understanding of historical development of the laws of motion of capitalist society. So that laws of motion, of course, the parallel to physics, the physical sciences. Interesting, but problematic when you begin to say, well, it's always like that. It's a law of nature or whatever, or a law of humanity. And you need to, check your reality then. So chapter 23. Now we're going to go from 23 to the end, and I hope we'll get there by the time we get to bring the news time. We now move on to accumulation. In an introductory note to part 7, Marx notes the abstract character of this initial discussion. Remember, we're still in volume 1 of Capital. He defines the circulation of capital in which capital passes through its various forms. Money is transformed into means of production and labor power in circulation. Means of production and labor power are converted into products that embody the original capital plus the surplus value in production. The products are then sold in circulation. So you have production and circulation as these two different circulatory questions. Production circulates too, in a different way, getting raw materials, bringing in labor, etc. The products are then sold in circulation with the aim of realizing the original capital plus surplus value in order to throw the augmented capital back into the fray by buying more means of production and labor power. In other words, you have to recover your costs, right, for all the raw materials, etc. And you have to pay off the workers, etc. But you need a little extra, right? You could call it research and development. You could call it stock buybacks. There's all kinds of stuff. And this is the thing that Marx worries about or is concerned about, because he knows this is happening right in front of him. And then Buddy Engels, that's how the, Engels mill works. The whole of the rest of the analysis of capital is formulated within this framework. Now, remember that this gets altered and, modified, and Marxists have arguments about all these little matters as if there were a single truth. And I think there are multiple truths, and they work with, it depends on which emphasis you want to talk about. The consumption side, which we haven't gotten to yet, that happens in further volumes, but, consumption is the sort of thing. Some people just, they feel better after they bought something, or they need to buy stuff because you just need the stuff, right? It's why we're at this current moment where people, it's the weird thing, security-wise, people lock up baby formula and diapers in supermarkets because, this is, they cost a lot, and also they're in demand in a very specific time period. That is when your kid is born, you need all this extra stuff. And some people are willing, not necessarily themselves to shoplift it, but other people do. And it's kind of interesting to see, you sort of look at, the police blotter and you see, some person was arrested for shoplifting, and they did a serious shoplifting thing. In other words, they got, a lot of baby formula and diapers. They're just doing that because they've got a kid to deal with, or else they're, obviously going to resell it at large scale. For the moment, Marx simplifies the analysis of accumulation by making two fundamental assumptions. First, he abstracts from the sphere of circulation altogether. And he's just doing this to, make the argument sort of spare economic or slim, that all commodities are sold without any difficulty or selling costs at their value. This is obviously a very restrictive assumption, for circulation is as much a part of the cycle of accumulation as is production. It's relaxed in volume 2. That's what I was saying about future volumes, that discusses production and circulation. We're looking at Department 1, which is production, and Department 2, which is circulatory or consumption oriented or exchange oriented. You could, that's the problem, of course, with Marx, is that some of these things overlap. Secondly, Marx assumes that there are only capitalists and workers. Now, there are all kinds of other people, but, only capitalists and workers. So we're looking at a sort of limited model, ignoring the different forms of capital. So ignoring rent, interest, money, the credit system, a whole bunch of other things. Banks, for example. This assumption is relaxed in volume 3, when the division of surplus value between individual capitalists and between profits, rent, and interest is discussed. So we don't get to the critique of, Donald Trump until volume 3, if that's kind of where you're headed. Thus, Marx focuses his attention on one phase of the process of accumulation alone. The fact that in the analysis of volumes 1 and 2, Marx does not consider the division of surplus value between different capitalists, but only considers the total relation between capital and labor is very important. So it's just simplified. And note that there's a lot of difference and variation and different agency and structure. It's going to get more complicated, but if you can sort of understand this basic idea that there's a kind of fight between capital and labor, but it's got lots of little subdivisions, that just, you need to wait until you get to the other volumes. And that for some people, it was tedious enough to do volume 1. And so, well, we're not going to look at volume 2, but, they think everything is reduced to production. And you could see that entire nations might have this little productive bias because maybe that's all you can get to, that focus on labor, appeal to classes of labor. And if you can get that revolution started, maybe everything else will fall in place. And some people actually say it like that. In other words, why are you worrying about identity politics when it's really about work and the working class and the fight with capital, et cetera, et cetera? And all of the little arguments that we have, calling people names, trots, tankies, blah, 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 blah. That's all, it gets a little stupid. You need to step back a little, take a breath, and sort of understand this is a big structure. Took several centuries to argue about it. And it finally, it's still a problem. And it's been a problem for 150 plus years. Marx, for the bulk of his analysis, ignores the fact that there are many capitals, each independent of the others, to conduct the analysis at the level of capital in general. Now, this is just an assumption, a working assumption, although the existence of many capitals is implicit, for example, is the introduction of competition between capitals at various points in the analysis. Implicitly, of course, such competition is always assumed in the argument, but it's only through competition that the law of value is imposed on particular capitals, and so can be assumed at the level of capital in general. Now, another aside, and the point is that some capitalists will say, oh, it's all command economy. Do you want socialists telling you what to do and what to buy and blah, 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 blah. Command economies, there are very few command economies. And even those command economies have markets. So you just got to get over the propaganda. And so it can be assumed at the level of capital in general, on the concepts of capital in general, and many capitals. You should look at Radulski's book, and it's a fairly old book, but it is one that is written during a time when you sort of got to correct some of these problems about the command economy, et cetera. And in the post-war period, a lot of people look at Radulski's book to kind of work through some of these issues, that there's more details here. And then there's Ben Fine, who reviews this kind of stuff in a much later article and kind of points everyone back and goes, well, in the post-Stalinist period, we sort of got to look at stuff a little more closely. So the restrictive assumptions made in volume 1 was borne in mind when reading the analysis of accumulation presented here. The relaxation, remember I asked you to relax, of these assumptions in volume 2 and 3 considerably modifies the account. Beware of those, this is Simon Clarke, beware of those who try to apply the analysis of volume 1 directly to the real world. Now, some people just ignore that, and some people never get to volume 2 and 3 because it's another 2,000 stupid pages or whatever. And it seems kind of complete after chapter 31 or something, and it's not it. You gotta kind of look at it in a much more, as it were, literary context, but not reduce it to literature. Chapter 23 considers the case of simple reproduction. In the first place, reproduction is simply another way of regarding production, that is, production as second period or second moment. If the surplus value that acquires the form of a revenue arising out of capital, that is, you're making money, is consumed by the capitalist, and the capital laid out in the next period will be unchanged. We are dealing with simple reproduction. All the costs are covered in that sense, where there is no change in scale because surplus value is consumed rather than being reinvested. Okay, that research and development or stock buybacks. However, looking at the process as a process of reproduction does introduce some changes in our understanding of it. Thus, it becomes clear that the worker is paid a portion for his or her own product, although this transaction is veiled. Remember, we've talked a little bit about money veils. Is veiled by the commodity form of the product and the money form of the commodity. So in Rawls, it's not that different from what Rawls is talking about. Thus, variable capital is therefore only a particular historical form of appearance of the fund for providing the means of subsistence. Remember, we're talking about the workers working enough to get personal revenue, that is, wage, to survive. Note again the concept of form, historical form of appearance. Form being used to conceptualize the historically specific character of a particular social process. So it's not all these isolated individuals, but rather it's a system of interactions. You've got to go to the payroll, office to get your check and blah, 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 blah. And it's mystified, of course, when you have direct deposit. It is only when the process is seen within the context of reproduction that this becomes clear, and the idea that variable capital is advanced by the capitalist disappears. Even if the capitalists advance the variable capital in the first place, it's not long before the capitalist has consumed all his original capital, so that all that's left is capitalized surplus value. Lest you think that that's unimportant, Sam Bankman-Fried, he starts using up the surplus. This is finance capital, of course, but he uses up the surplus, buys his parents a place in Bermuda, buys himself, cars and other kind of crazy shit. And then he gets caught because, he hasn't left enough to cover the stuff. That's what makes it a Ponzi scheme. It doesn't really cover the value of what has been extracted. Thus, we see that the confrontation of capital and labor that originally appeared as the starting point of capitalist production is, in fact, its result. So a kind of inversion. Capitalist production is, in fact, the production of capital at one pole and free labor at the other. That is, available labor. When we look at the reproduction of the system as a whole, even the individual consumption of the worker, subsistence, becomes a part of the reproduction of the whole, since it's you need to have a house and blah 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 blah, feed the kids, feed the dog, blah blah blah. Since it is the reproduction of labor power, although in a capitalist society, at least this reproduction is left to the worker's own desire to reproduce him or herself. Do you have enough money to have kids? Since in this consumption, the worker consumes as means of subsistence, he or she has to return again to the labor market as wage labor. We haven't talked about saving or anything else. So, assume that we don't have certain other little variables in there. There's a kind of personal accumulation that goes on, but Marx isn't talking about this. He's talking about the big scale structural stuff because he wants to show that there's a class of people that's all they damn do. Thus, the worker is as much an appendage of capital as is the machine. His independence being an independence of any particular capitalist, but not of the capitalist class as a whole. Finally, after a long quotation, Marx sums up, the capitalist process of production, therefore, is seen as a total connected process, i.e., a process of reproduction produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, the capitalist, on the other, the waged laborer. Hopefully you can see that mentally, what's going on, that this is just part of the system that does this. And, the capitalist class does other things with their money, right? They, at the poor end or at the more incompetent end, they buy their kids' place into Harvard with those things, whereas you don't have shit to accept debt in order to get your kid into maybe Harvard, or as Ron DeSantis says, the Harvard of the woke in Florida. Chapter 24, Marx now considers reproduction on an increasing scale as surplus value is converted into capital. That's what happens. The employment of surplus value as capital, or its reconversion into capital, is called accumulation of capital. The accumulation of capital implies that the means of production and the means of subsistence that are to be purchased by the reinvested surplus value have in fact been produced. Thus, accumulation depends on a certain physical composition of production. And this is reproduction schemes that you'll see in volume 2. You sort of get all this crap together, and then what happens in the next period? And lest you think this doesn't happen, this is all about accounting. And had Marx taken an accounting course or had thought a little bit more about this, he would have probably worked this out a little better. And this goes back to my little thing that I mentioned last time, my continuing bugaboo, the counterfactual of Marx actually have an academic appointment, maybe in Manchester or something. Marx goes on to look at the implications of the fact that the working class is employed by capital, that is the product of its own surplus labor. He argues that the real meaning of the laws of private property, that is the laws of appropriation, so that's kind of private property and appropriation are kind of brought together based on the production and circulation of commodities, is inverted, that the real meaning is inverted. Originally, property develops as property, and the product of one's own labor, and exchange is the exchange of equivalents. Yet when the capitalist and worker confront one another, although every exchange continues to obey the laws of commodity exchange, the relation as a whole is one in which capital is itself merely a portion of the product of labor which has been appropriated without an equivalent that is reproduced with a surplus by its producer. This is where the skimming occurs. Well, that part of the surplus, that's not yours. That's the company's. That's, we need to grow. We need to research. We need to develop. But secretly, we're buying back stock. Thus, the form of the relation between capitalist and worker, the form of exchange, becomes a mere semblance or resemblance that only has any reality if we restrict our attention to circulation. The content of the relation is quite different. For on the basis of the equal exchange in the sphere of circulation, the capitalist is able to appropriate labor without an equivalent in the process as a whole. This is that skimming we talked about, the difference between relative and absolute surplus value. You get kind of this little thing, this value skimmed off. Thus, the real law of capitalist appropriation is the inverse of the formal law that continues to be the law of appropriation, property law of commodity production. Property law of commodity production is built on top of a property law largely derived from land. So there is a structural relation between the solidity, the authority of land law on commodity production. It is only if we focus on individual buyers and sellers, i.e. on circulation, that this reality is concealed. For within circulation, there's no basis for this class relation. Anybody can walk in and buy crap. Everyone can buy a Ferrari. Now, whether the bank owns it or you own it is kind of a different question. Between capitalists and workers, that is at the root of capitalist appropriation. We're up to page 732 to 3, and then nota bene. Marx is arguing that it is only as a class that the exploitation of labor by capital appears, since a particular individual is, for example, not necessarily employed by a capital that represents his or her own past labor. It's kind of when Boeing moved its headquarters from Seattle to Chicago and shit started happening and quality control and other things got out of control and planes started falling out of the sky. And that classes cannot be conceptualized on the basis of commodity exchange. Section 2, finally we get to Section 2, briefly refers to the erroneous conception that the political economists had of reproduction. They believe that all surplus value is converted into labor power as capitalists consume it unproductively by taking on more retainers, etc., or as they employ it for accumulation by taking on productive laborers, that is surplus value laborers. They, yeah, we can afford to hire more people, we're going to pay it back eventually. Marx notes, this is not the case in terms of cost recovery. The additional capital has to be laid out to buy both labor power and the means of production. If it is to enter the accumulation process, he will return to this illusion later. Now, note that this is what happens under capitalism, that some things are not accountable. We sort of don't know where the money went. Needless to say, that's kind of where we are with certain felons that who have been convicted. Nobody knew where the money was going, and certain felons say, well, this is just normal. This is just past practice. And I've gotten away with it for so long that this must be political, that you're trying to do this to me. I am such a victim, blah, blah, blah. In the third section, Marx goes on to look at the development of the concept of capitalist savings and consumption. This is an interesting section because it has an extended discussion of the way in which the motivation of the capitalist develops historically, and of the way in which political economists' conception of the capitalist has developed correspondingly. So you have all these ideologies, but it's a free market, there's free trade, it should be unfettered. It's all going to grow. You shouldn't worry about this. In the early stages of accumulation, the capitalist was compelled to be miserly and abstemious. That is, this is the Protestant work ethic, as as Max Weber talks about, right? Protestant ethic. Calvinistically, we have some sort of a thriftiness at work. And political economy contrasted him with the wanton and idle aristocrat who wasted capital and consumption. He spent time, chafing about royalty or, the idle rich, blah, blah, blah. Thus, all consumption by the capitalist was seen as a betrayal of his capitalist duty. So you see this, this issue sort of created, and it is why there are very few business schools that have ethics courses. Later, as accumulation progresses, it becomes possible and even necessary for capitalist consumption to increase. As the capitalists came to be confronted from 1848 by the working class, rather than the landowner, vulgar economics, that is sort of, vulgar economy, came to replace political economy. So you have political economy, then you have this kind of, well, that's just the way it is. For Marx, vulgar economy is a purely apologetic recitation of the superficialities of capitalist societies. There's a certain kind of nihilism about it. Political economy is a genuinely scientific, though still bourgeois, attempt to understand it. So you can see that this difference between economics and political economy is divided in the same way. You can have economics studied in the School of Letters and Science, and the business school studies just the economy. So there's some weird division, and there's cross-fertilization and problematic elements, and there's a difference between business economics and political economy, blah, 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 blah. And you can see that these are ideologically driven and still quasi-scientific. Suddenly, because of accumulation being considered the sacred duty of the capitalist, the means by which you remained a capitalist, if you read Hayek, that's kind of how it reads, or Mies, von Mies, it becomes an act of self-denial, of abstinence from consumption, so that profit comes to be seen as the reward for this self-denial. Look what I gave up in order to do this. And this is, as an aside, the basis for philanthropy, right? You see philanthropy develop as well, I'm going to get a tax break for this, so I'm going to give money away to, and it never, it never clears. Let's put it that way. So there's problems galore there. To criticize this view, Marx simply points out that reproduction on an increasing scale, and so abstinence from consumption, is characteristic in the economic formations of many kinds of society without those societies having capital. You could do this in slavery, for example. Abstinence is a universal feature of expanded reproduction, while capital is a particular economic category in social relations. Now, you could do this in the feudal period. What are you doing? You're saving up a bunch of gold, right? And, it's just sort of what we deserve because, we're on a mission from God, whatever. So those kind of excuses come. Given the rate at which capitalists consume out of surplus value, the rate of accumulation will depend on the magnitude of surplus value, and so on the factors that determine that magnitude. Marx discusses such factors as forcing wages below the value of labor power, increasing the duration and or intensity of labor so as to economize on means of production. You're part of a family. We all need to pull together on this. And increasing the productivity of labor. If you work a little harder, there'll be other benefits that will come. The company will grow and, they will be able to afford other things for you. An increase in the productivity of labor means that the same quantity of goods cost less. This is where price kind of gets thrown in there. Thus, the capitalist can maintain the same standard of living while increasing the amount of surplus value thrown back into production. In the same way, a given magnitude of capital can employ more laborers, more means of production, and so both the physical and the value rate of accumulation increases. So you have a physical and a value rate. Physical rate of accumulation and a value rate of accumulation increases. I deserve 5 cars. I can only drive one at any time, but I sort of deserve that. I own the company, whatever, or I work really hard, or whatever. As accumulation progresses, the role of past labor in the form of the instruments of labor increases. Just as with all the powers of labor, this power of past labor comes to appear as the power of capital. Remember, appear. Qualities in the means of production are attributed to the specific social form in which they confront labor, i.e. to capital. In the last section, Marx criticizes the labor fund theory that argued that there was only a fixed fund available to supply the workers so that the total wage bill was invariable. Now, kind of Ricardo sort of believes in this, so there's a whole other set of issues. Hence, if one worker had a pay increase, others would either have their pay reduced or lose their jobs. I actually had a boss who told a female member of our faculty that she was complaining about her wages, and he said, "Well, you want me to reduce everyone at the same rank down to your pay scale? That's just absurd." Needless to say, a lawsuit could have been engaged, but there's a whole set of other politics at work. Hence, if one worker had a pay increase, others would either have to have their pay reduced or lose their jobs. This theory presupposes both that the supply of wage goods is fixed and that workers cannot encroach on capitalist consumption, and that a given number of workers provide a given amount of labor, so that a given labor fund sets a fixed limit to accumulation. It is a theory that persists today. This is why, as an aside, before we start 25, why Varoufakis, Yanis Varoufakis, talks about techno-feudalism, that the techno-feudalism is exactly the same argument about a kind of relatively fixed labor fund. Anyway, but of course this engages all the other little provisos that I began yakking about. Chapter 25, we're getting close to the end. This chapter investigates the accumulation of capital more closely. Marx firstly introduces the concept of the composition of capital. This is a structural kind of argument. The value composition of capital is the proportion in which the capital is divided between constant and variable capital. I'm sorry. Shut your microphone off. Damn it. The technical composition of capital refers to the physical relationship between means of production and labor in the process of production. The organic composition of capital. This is a big argument. A decade is spent on the organic composition of capital problem. Is defined as the value composition of capital insofar as it's determined by its technical composition and mirrors, and that's the problem for many people, the changes in the latter. This definition is not altogether clear. And we spend a decade, literally, there's a decade spent worrying about this composition. There you get articles back and forth and what counts as organic. Did you mean organic? What did you mean by inorganic, in fact? So it's just stupid. It seems that what Marx is saying is that the organic composition is the same as the value composition if we abstract from changes in the value of labor power or of means of production. It is the ratio. See, Marx tries to always work this out as a function of ratios. So it's a ratio of means of production to labor power valued at constant prices. So this is the mistake where it happens. You assume that price has a certain, you can hold it constant, but the reality is the prices constantly change. In fact, we're now in a period where prices are getting cut in various places, and it's a good thing. But there are lags, of course. It's just been announced that there's going to be a sort of a carbon glut or a gas glut, a gasoline glut, and so prices of gas actually should go down. Now we see a sort of front end signal of that, but needless to say, there will be lags because people want to continue to make profits. So whatever. And so abstracting from changes in the productivity of labor and the production of means of production or labor power with a given organic composition of capital, accumulation of capital implies an increase in the number of workers. Not necessarily true, but unemployment is lower and getting lower at the current moment. Eventually, such an increase may outstrip the supply of labor power so that wages rise. However, such a rise in wages does not affect the nature of exploitation or accumulation. Some things are the same. It could never go so far as to erode together surplus labor. Thus, the reduction can never go so far as to threaten the system itself. This is Marx, in the 19th century, he's going, well, it's just not like Smith talks about it. People are institutionally speaking or structurally speaking, some people are not going to want the whole thing to screw up. If the price of labor rises enough to reduce the rate of accumulation, then the demand for labor falls and the pressure on wages is reduced. Thus, the mechanism of the capitalist production process removes the very obstacle it temporarily creates. And so you could say this is an argument for colonialism and imperialism in one sense, to shift production or consumption to other places. Hence, the rate of accumulation is not determined by the supply of labor. And Marx is applying a critique to his own reasoning. Rather, it is fluctuations in the rate of accumulation that determine the amount of exploitable labor power. See, Marx is using this abstraction not to get bogged down in some of the empirical details. Here, Marx is arguing against those who see accumulation as being determined by the rate of growth of population. It's not Malthus. He's trying to go beyond Malthus. It's not simply because people are having kids that reproduction in its more literal way is. He argues that instead that it's accumulation that determines the growth of employment, i.e. accumulation is a social process expressing the exploitation of labor and not a natural process. That is, it's kind of, it always happens this way, expressing population growth. Now, lest you think that's unemployment, inapplicable here in development economics. Some people, and in fact, I think you can say that migration has certain, people who migrate to do capital export. That is, people who run the risk of going across a border into another country in order to work to accumulate to develop capital resources, savings or whatever, and to export that capital back to the homeland on the other side of the border. You'll note that it's not infinite. That in fact they actually have targets, or that they could only work so hard. And so therefore, there's certain limitations that are created on this activity. So the literature goes way back into the early post-war period in terms of development research. And it studies the effect of urbanization or modernism or modernization, whatever the modernity, whatever, on family size. So that even if you're going to be a racist and say, well, they reproduce like rabbits or minks or whatever, this is not true. They don't always have tons of kids and whatever. There are incentives to do it in certain societies. You get more deductions because you have more kids, blah 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 blah. But remember, this takes time and resources, and so it doesn't cost out that that's really going to happen. And some people just simply target. They set the size of their family smaller, and there's actually a lot of research that talks about this, that people restrict the size of their family, which has a demographic problem. And so, for example, they're not going to replace us, blah blah blah. This group of people is only 8% of the population, and so therefore, but in order to stay in power, we're going to make them the scapegoats. And what are we going to use? We're going to use certain, racial theories that go back centuries to argue that, it's just going to mean they're going to reproduce more. And, you just can't have that happen. There's going to be fewer of us because we've already set our optimal family size to, 2.5 kids and, a third of a car, whatever. In the second section, Marx considers changes in the organic composition of capital as accumulation is associated with a steadily increasing productivity of labor, and this in turn implies a steady increase in the technical composition of capital. That is, more equipment, more technology. As a consequence of increasing productivity, each worker turns more raw materials into products, while correspondingly the introduction of more massive machinery, computers, numerically controlled machines to assist the worker is a cause of increasing productivity. Finally, Marx argues that this change in the technical composition of capital is reflected in an increase in the value composition. Remember, he's talking about his abstractions here. The value composition is the proportion of capital laid out as constant capital steadily increases. Nota bene, this in fact assumes that the prices of means of production do not fall as a result of increases in productivity faster than their volume increases. In other words, the subcontractors who are making machines that are nearby, are they, working harder and making available, better machines, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this kind of, remember, it's about command. It is about control and command. The process of accumulation is a process of the expansion of capitalist production and an increase in its scale. This is the growth thing. This involves both the increasing concentration of the means of production in the hands of ever larger capitalists, not that they're fatter, but, et cetera, and the appearance of new capitalists in competition with one another. This is the venture capitalist thing. Apart from this concentration of capital as a result of accumulation, there's also a centralization of capitalism as more profitable capitals swallow up less profitable ones. That's why there are Russian banks in San Jose, California. Centralization is a result of the economies of scale that enable large capitals to outcompete small ones. The intense competition between smaller capitals that drives many to ruin. And 3, the operation of the credit system. And you can see where screw-ups can occur. Centralization fostered by the rise of the credit system and the joint stock company. The joint stock company is an older construction, but generally it's the same structure of how the stock market sort of operates, serves itself to accelerate accumulation by bringing together much larger masses of capital than could be amassed by concentration alone, thus permitting large-scale enterprises, for example, railways. In the 19th century, this is, because the railway brings together steam engines, steel, coal, mining. It brings together all kinds of crap, and that's where they can thrive, but also fail because, it's really hard once you build a railway to, whatever. Once you start building the damn thing, it's kind of hard to pay for at certain moments, as you've probably seen. Finally, the rising organic composition of capital means that fewer and fewer workers are employed by a given size of capital, and correspondingly, the renewal of old capital, that is, old means of production, outdated machines, fewer cylinders on your steam engines and blah, 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 blah. Outdated machines tends to displace workers. In the third section, Marx considers the displacement of labor in the course of accumulation. He argues that there's a rising organic composition of capital means that a larger capital is required to maintain a given level of employment. Thus, to maintain employment, accumulation must become progressively more rapid. At the same time, though, more rapid accumulation means a more rapid increase in the organic composition. So this is why ratios are important. Thus, to the extent that accumulation cannot be rapid enough to absorb the whole working population, it's still Malthusian in that sense. Accumulation itself produces a relatively redundant working population, i.e., it creates unemployment. This is the relative surplus population that creates the reserve army of labor, et cetera, that's mentioned in the manifesto. Because of the unevenness of capital development, this relative surplus population is constantly being created in some branches of production and is often reabsorbed in others, and this on an ever-increasing scale. So there's some sort of transfer of knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. You have skills, but there's a certain moment at which that can or can't happen. This surplus population is a condition for the existence of the capitalist mode of production. As the industrial reserve army that provides a mass of available labor power independent of the natural growth of population. So this is where Malthus doesn't work, and permits accumulation to proceed unevenly. You see, you can't just measure it against food supply in that the Malthusian sense. This relative surplus population is both created by and makes possible the cyclical character of developed capitalism that is associated with rapid and uneven changes in the composition of capital. Malthus doesn't talk about capital, you see. The industrial reserve army also by its competition forces the employed workers to submit to intensified labor, so further reducing employment. Thus, it is the expansion and contraction of the industrial reserve army that exclusively regulates the general movements of wages. Now, it's quite true that we don't, there's lags in here. You have to figure out, well, what's the average wage in this industry? And then you have regional differences of the space and time thing that Harvey works out. In other words, in certain places in the country, because of right to work laws or blah, 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 you have all this kind of wage differentials. And yes, the government does measure. This is why you have labor statistics. Thus, the supply and demand for labor are not independent of one another, but both are aspects of this larger thing called the accumulation of capital. Accumulation both employs workers and throws them onto the labor market. And the mechanism of capitalist production takes care that the absolute increase of capital is not accompanied by a corresponding rise in the general demand for labor, i.e. if accumulation exhausts the reserve army and wages rise, then this gives a stimulus to the increasing organic composition of capital that displaces workers so that wages fall back. Now, this would be nice if it really worked, but it doesn't because there are six-figure income salaries for full professors, and for adjunct professors, the rate is totally different. The fourth section looks in more depth at the relative surplus populations, and there are three basic forms. There's a floating form, which we kind of apply that kind of gig economy thing. It refers to workers who are in and out of work, displaced by cyclical fluctuations, technical advance, got to go back and learn more programming, younger workers, etc. The latent form of the relative surplus population refers to those workers who are in employment, but in backward sectors and bad conditions, especially in agriculture, who are therefore always ready to flow into alternative employment. This explains the seasonal difference in agricultural work, why Mexicans are all over the damn place in the United States, etc. You may not think that that's important, but there are decades of the question of, well, why are there so many Mexicans in Minnesota? And there weren't that many, but it was pretty clear that there's something going on, especially when you have an accident with a panel van, and there are 15 damn people thrown in the damn thing, and you only hear about it when the van crashes on an icy road. The stagnant form is in very irregular employment, and then on very bad terms, casual workers, seasonal workers, etc. So there's, it's similar but not identical. Beneath these forms, but part of the reserve army are paupers, poor people, and beneath them, the lumpen, right? Criminals. And, I've actually operated organizations where apparently, and this was because my my one-person HR department hired people who essentially work in that their primary gig was in boiler rooms trying to scam people out of other, that's their other job, was to just scam people using phones and computers. And beneath them, the lumpen proletariat. Note that Marx sees the stagnant form of the reserve army as a self-reproducing and self-perpetuating element of the working class. I still get, with all due respect, spam phone calls from various places, from states in which I used to work more than a decade ago, and they're still kind of built on that same model, and they're still trying to find me so that they can ultimately scam something from me in a historical context, because I know when I do the little search, I can find out exactly where the phones are coming from. And yes, there is this little, thing in the back of my mind that I should show up with where the actual, boiler room is. And well, anyway, be Trump-like. But the theory of relative surplus population is also part of the theory of the internal differentiation of the working class. So the working class has, on the one hand, people do honest work. On the other hand, some people do dishonest work, and they work at it. Marx sees the constant growth of the reserve army and of pauperism as the counterparts of the process of capital accumulation. It's a counterpart. This is the absolute general law of capital accumulation. Although Marx adds, like all other laws, it's modified in its working by many circumstances. Thus, he does not necessarily regard it as an inevitable or universal law. Some people might actually get morals. Do they get them at the same rate as the people who lose their morals? That's a different question. And yet, lest you think that that's unimportant, there is something that is defined in the Trump case as transactional, which is sort of what's it called? Situational ethics. The following 2 pages spell out the general point involved here, that under capitalism, accumulation is not for the benefit of the worker, but it's the means by which his or her position is steadily worsened, not simply in an economic sense. And anyone who's had a career, you can see the variation in full-time wages on that basis. And if you do enough interviewing, you begin to see, well, Jesus, how much of a wage cut do I have to take in order to continue to be fully gainfully employed? How much am I going to lose in the transition? Blah, blah, blah. The final section of this chapter illustrates the general law of capitalist accumulation by providing a succession of examples of the growth of poverty and unemployment in the midst of rapid accumulation, concentration, and centralization of capital. This is the entire Sunbelt problem. Marx never knew about the Sunbelt, but this is kind of what goes on. The Sunbelt versus Rust Belt issue, which has been there for decades. And is sort of still there. Note at the beginning of subsection D, page 822 of volume 1 of Capital, Marx refers to the best paid section of the working class as its aristocracy. Lest you think that's unimportant, as I usually say, there are labor aristocracies. People in unions, with all due respect, certain types of trade unions, artisanal unions, do function as a kind of labor aristocracy where they control race, gender, etc., entry into professions. And, without going into long detailed examination of that, but you can see that Marx's examination of accumulation in part 7 of volume 1 ties together his earlier analysis by relating the parts of the system together into an interdependent and dynamic whole. Thus, for example, the separation of the labor from the means of production and subsistence on the one hand, and the confrontation of this same labor with money capital on the other, were initially seen as being separate preconditions of capitalist production. And this is, how you divide up labor to fight against itself. The analysis of accumulation ties these together and shows how capitalist production creates not only use values, not only values, but also capitalist social relations. Capital and wage labor are both products of the accumulation of capital. In the same way, the growth of the labor force or the market are not factors external to capitalist production, but are themselves aspects of the accumulation process. In other words, why are you buying that pickup truck when you really don't need a pickup truck? In part 8 of volume 1, Marx rounds off his account of the social relation between labor and capital by examining the origins of that relation. Just as in the process of accumulation, capital and free labor, the joint production is actually an important concept. So we still come back to this of capitalist production. So the origins of capitalist production are sought by Marx in the social process that created jointly capital and free labor. This is the process in which the workers, that is, peasants and artisans, are dispossessed of their means of production and subsistence, the process of primitive accumulation. This is a difference, or what has been reproduced in the issues of kind of examining primitive accumulation and settler colonialism and using it to analyze the differences between laboring classes and a whole variety of other kind of relations. So the difference between Palestinians and Israelis are ones of both primitive accumulation and capitalist accumulation. And they're both of them. One is not superseding the other. And in fact, another is imposed so that, you can control people. In chapter 26, Marx argues, and we're almost to the end, Marx argues that we cannot find the origins of capitalist production simply in the sum of money. For if saved by an industrious worker, for money can only be transformed into capital through the purchase of labor power. Thus, feudal exploitation had to be changed into capitalist exploitation through the dispossession of the working population. Dispossession meaning, you no longer have this kind of work responsibility to the land. You're sent off. You got to go to the city. Go into the village. There's work there. Chapter 27, we see we're moved pretty quickly through the last 100 pages. Looks in detail at the expulsion of the agricultural population from the land, what I just said. Chapter 28 looks at the role of the state in the creation of a submissive working class. And yes, there is a submissive working class where when extra economic force had to be used to do what in a developed capitalist society is done by capital itself. I just can't afford to do this anymore. I got to go, work at whatever. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once it fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The silent compulsion of economic relations sets the seal on the domination of the capitalist over the worker. There's so few people, and with all due respect, who go postal, whatever that means. It's just, you want to be afraid of it a lot, but the fact of it, it just doesn't happen that much. Chapter 29 looks at the origins of the class of capitalist farmers and the rural middle class. That's a whole nother set of issues. Chapter 30 looks at the creation of the home market as opposed to the international market as a product of the expropriation of the mass of the population who now had to buy means of production and subsistence that they previously provided for themselves. In other words, people used to live in villages and, you could sort of, you get stuff from the land and blah, blah, and you can't do that anymore because you can't have, if you're in a city, of course, there's no place to grow anything. And then, you can't, I suppose you could kill stray cats and dogs, but, it's kind of hard to hunt. Chapter 31 looks at the relation between commercial and financial capitalist activities and the rise of the industrial capitalists. Includes the famous quote, "Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power." Now, this idea of force as an economic power, if you're a libertarian, this is a big deal. It's a real problem. Chapter 32, and we're at the end finally. And it took me just over an hour. Chapter 32 sums up the whole of volume 1. Primitive accumulation is the expropriation of petty private property by capital. Capitalist accumulation continues this process with the centralization of capital and the socialization of labor until they become incompatible with their capitalist integument, the surface of the capitalist economy. And this integument is burst asunder. So it's all about carbuncles, still all about carbuncles. And so I include a little abstract from an article that talks more about this difference between primitive accumulation and capital accumulation or capitalist accumulation, and the profound importance in terms of the logic of separation, of alienation and estrangement, which what humanists would talk about, and the issue of how all these relations work together, and which is what Marx has been talking about throughout the entirety of Volume 1, and that is how these relations are constitutive. That they're sociological. Well, kind of. There aren't very many mountain men, mountain women, and survivalist preppers. There really aren't that many of them, and that kind of separation is trumped always by people who were living paycheck to paycheck, et cetera, et cetera. And I put in a little selling point diagram for what's going on in terms of common or shared stuff, which we went through at great length, great and tedious lengths, about certain things that in this entire process of unevenness, we get certain common things: public spaces, political spaces, places of resistance, places, territories of contention. You have all of these kinds of things that are part of modern society. Farmers driving their damn tractors and in big parades to the Capitol, blah blah blah, and it is, with all due respect, more interesting when the French do it than when Americans do it, because Americans are too stupid to try and work out what a real farmers' protest would be, with all due respect. And of course, the ideologies that are attended there. So you're going to drive your really expensive John Deere tractor all the way down the road, on either diesel or regular gas, not even being a hybrid, which is a whole nother set of interesting issues for tractors, to protest, and it just doesn't quite do the same damn thing. And then so you resort, well, everybody with a truck, with an 18-wheeler should do this, and that'll bring them to their knees. And did it? No. So the American case, not quite the same. Whereas sort of the French, when they kind of do it, they kind of do it a little more aggressively, and also because there's a kind of sense of activism, particularly in the rural areas, that's a little bit fascistic, but ultimately they got a lot of stuff going on, and it is incredibly problematic. So the French do a slightly better job of this, or in certain smaller cases, the Belgians or whatever, Germans. So it's about integument, and so I put in a little what integument looks like. It includes the epidermis, and it's not just the surface, but rather it has strata. And so Marx is sort of making the skin analogy pretty interesting about what as J.D. Vance refers to it as to the mandatory conscription of, I assume, males, and in effect, in a Trumpian way, only white males. However, they try and do that. In terms of the military, J.D. Vance says, well, we're going to have skin in the game. Well, yeah, I guess it is skin in the game, mainly white skin. That's which is a contradiction. It's a false consciousness, because there's a significant number of people of color in the in the volunteer American military and National Guard. Okay, I'm done. And everyone's asleep. Are there questions, comments, brickbats? James, still awake? James? I put him to sleep, or he's walking the dog.
No, I'm still here. Sorry about that. I was saying I was groaning over my work, not over Marxism.
Okay. I do the same damn thing.
Surplus value. Speaking of
surplus
value, is I'm right. Working for the man, as they say.
Well, it's a paycheck, right?
It is a paycheck. I'm not complaining.
Speaking of paychecks, good news, everyone. Elon Musk is going to get his $56 billion paycheck.
What?
He worked so hard for it. He deserves it.
Oh, God, so disgusting.
And
I mean,
when that was announced, the stock goes up. Can you please explain that one to me?
Well, it's
right,
because you
because
know,
all that money goes to him.
yeah. Well, you know,
It comes out of the company and goes to him. Why is the stock going up?
that's how money laundering operates there, John. Remember
still don't get
the whatever the SWAC is has it's not located kind of any place, and so it and it's less regulated, so you can do all kinds of hanky panky.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's to the point we're worse than the robber barons were at the 19th century, right? I mean,
Yes, indeed.
we're far beyond that, it seems. And yet
Well,
people are fine with it. There's no pitchforks in the street.
capitalism is filled with bypass. You do kind of bypasses of various things, whether it's regulatory, direct regulation like a congestion price or other things. Capitalism constantly tries to figure out other ways of working around the system, of getting to the front of the line or whatever.
Well, and they figured out the ultimate, which is make it so that you can buy all your politicians when there's no restriction on
Oh yeah,
yeah. The bribery is now legal. So
it's just open, the
Exactly.
super PAC business.
And Elon is going to have $56 billion to flood the election with.
To help Trump. I know. That actually is worrisome. If someone that rich is that pro-Trump. But I mean, we had Adelson, so it's not that much different.
Oh, his wife is giving $100 million, right, to Trump?
Some more great news, John.
What's that?
Nigel Farage's party, Reform, have overtaken the Tories in the polls for the election.
No.
Christ.
Yeah.
So they'll actually have seats in Parliament.
More than the Tories. They're going to wipe the Tory party out.
We'll see, but yeah.
Wow.
I mean, what kind of
replace
idiot?
Replace it with fash. That's the difference, because the fascists, the whole Hitler apologists. There's like 30 of the candidates or something being investigated for being in far-right groups and shit. So, yeah.
It's just amazing. I mean, there was no bigger enemy to Britain than Hitler.
Exactly. And this is why Corbyn was so essential. Because he was the last. It all could have been avoided. He was the adult in the room. But we don't.
You have these center-left parties that make sure that no reform can take place. So the obvious result is going to be this.
Navarra have done an investigation into the people Labour are parachuting into various places. Half of them work for David Cameron.
Oh, God.
So when I was jokingly saying, it's, Labour basically Cameron era Tories now, they've quite literally fucking are.
Yeah.
Cameron set up a consultancy firm, and they're all from that firm.
And he's still foreign minister.
Yeah. He's a lord. And Starmer's launched the Labour manifesto today, and it's just basically, oh well, it's our turn now. There's nothing of note that's going to help anyone. Like, it's just austerity 2.0. And well, this is how bland. I'll post in the chat. This is how bland the cover is. of the manifesto. That's it. That's the cover of them. That is the cover. Yeah, that's the cover of the Labour manifesto.
Oh,
This is
And I've
open to
not
so much parody.
even centrists have gone. We've got this. We've opened it, and it's basically just photographs of Keir Starmer.
who's very unpopular.
Yeah, Kevin Maguire. He's a proper Starmer lad, and he's like, "What the fuck's this?" when they've got the manifesto. I think it's too late. Too late will be the cry. It's starting to sink in with the centrists now. Like, hang on, he is pretty shit, isn't he? And he's made the party. It's all about him. With Corbyn, it was your party, our party, we, us, me, you. With him, it's always my party. He never affiliates it with the people. I don't understand it, and we're sort of going, "Oh well, at least he's not a Tory." It's like he's just got a different fucking coloured tie on. In fact, you're right. He's not a Tory. He's borderline fascist. He's picked fucking